Check. Microphone. Am I good? On? No? Apparently not. Oh? Is that it? Jeez, there we go. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. It's always hard to follow up Brandon, even when he's doing announcements. He is very eloquent. He's very good at his job. But, yeah, it's actually kind of baffling. I was back there when Brandon had you guys do all the talking and everything, and it sounds like a much larger group from over there. So I'm very impressed. Y'all are very loud this morning. I hope you guys can keep it up for me as I preach this morning. So thank you guys. And so I know some of you are probably thinking, why am I up here? Because Dave is sitting right here. But apparently there's this thing called jet lag, and it's like 3 a.m. for Dave. So I get to come up here this morning and do one last sermon for our Overflow series. And so, as we bring this series to a close, my idea for this sermon was to just take some time to take stock of where we are at. For all of us to look back at the past 7.5 sermons, Brandon had that 2.5, and to see where we are at and what we've done with the things that we've learned and that we've heard. To see if we are overflowing. I want us to be retrospective and ask, what was the point of this whole sermon series? In the past weeks, we've had some really fantastic lessons, right? We had Brandon coming out with the water bottles and showing us that, if we aren't working to change what is inside of us, right, to really change who we are, then we're going to keep getting the same results over and over again, right? Or him giving us the new perspective on Jesus' miracle of water to wine and what that means for us. We talked about the redemptive arc for the woman at the well. Quenching our thirst and breaking the cycles that we have been stuck in so we can become a well for the people in our lives. Dave let us know that we're all pieces of work, but that we have gifts, and that as a community, if we're all overflowing, our gifts can impact the community as a whole. That the greatest gift that we can have is love. If you haven't heard all of these sermons, they are all on YouTube. I make sure of that. And I want you guys to be able to go back and watch those because they're so good. But my point here is that there have been some amazing and challenging points made. And the question I really want to ask us is, what are we doing with it? As we've sat and listened for 2 months, what have we taken away from this? Is this series going to be different from all the other series that I've heard here? And I'm going to get real for a second. I've heard many sermons and sermon series in my life, and I'm sure you guys have as well. So many, in fact, that I had a hard time actually remembering what our last series was. And I made the graphic for it. So it was Christmas at the Movies, if anyone was wondering, if anyone remembered that. I'm impressed. But as I was working on the idea for the sermon, I was asking myself, how many great points have I heard? Numerous, I'm sure, right? But the kicker is, how many do I remember? Is anyone else here with me? I'm a regular guy, just like everyone that's sitting here. I wish I could say that coming up on stage and that preaching has given me some amazing skill of being able to remember all the great points and great sermons I've heard and act on all of them. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Unfortunate. But I kept thinking about how I've treated the lessons and the advice and the scripture that I've heard in my life. How much wisdom have I squandered by doing nothing with it? And I'm sure we've all heard amazing lessons and said, man, that was challenging. But my question is, if we haven't done anything because of it, was it really? Were we really inspired if nothing in our lives has changed? There's a level of action that we need to have, that we need to take to not squander what it is we are hearing. A level of work that we need to be putting in that is deeply biblical. So let's jump over to Matthew 7:24 through 27. We're going wise and foolish builders. Shout out Ashley, by the way, just doing the most on the slides this morning. She's great. But it says in 24, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. You know, there's an interesting mirroring going on here between this scripture and all of us sitting here right now. You know, here we have Jesus at the end of his Sermon on the Mount. He's wrapping it all up, just like we are with our sermon series. And he's ending it off with a call, with a challenge for people to put into action what they have heard from him on that day. And it's just a little humbling to see that he just gave what a lot of people consider to be the greatest sermon ever written, right? Just bar after bar, line after line of convicting and challenging stuff. And yet right at the end, he still has to remind people that they have to go and do something. That just hearing his words is not enough. And it's almost baffling that Jesus, the Jesus, still had to remind people what it is they have to actually do to change. Calling them all to action, because he knows that most, if not all, aren't going to do it unprompted. And, you know, this is the challenge, and I think the problem that we still have today. And why I think it's so important for us to talk about this at the end of our series. You know, what have we done, and what are we going to do with the things that have challenged us? We've had 7 weeks of overflow, so what are we going to do about that? How are we going to look at and change our discipleship, our walks with God? What are we going to put into practice, like the scripture says, so that we can look back at this series of sermons and feel good about the things that we have done? You know, Jesus in the scripture is trying to help us prepare and be ready for the inevitable struggle that's going to come, right? The inevitability of life. And he wants us to be prepared because the rain is going to come. The streams will overflow, and what we have built will be put to the test. The calling here is action. It's taking steps to do what it is we have heard, what has challenged us, what has inspired us. And at the end of the day, if we aren't choosing to do something with what we hear, what we read, what we are taught, to change our problems, right? To make ourselves more like the scripture, then those things are just going to keep coming back. The storms will keep coming. You know, if I'm cynical and I'm burnt out, then I'll stay cynical and burnt out. And if I'm going through a rough patch with my faith, then I'm going to stay in that rough patch. And I think that's what's so amazing about this scripture, is that Jesus is giving us a clear set of instructions, and instructions that can change our lives if we choose to follow them. These instructions inform us where to build and how to do it. You know, when we build right, when we follow the instructions, when we put these things into practice, we end up with a foundation not rooted in ourselves or the things and the people in our lives, and our security is in something that can't be shaken. And that means that when the hard things in life happen, our entire foundation isn't rocked. It's stable because it's outside of ourselves. We've taken the time to do what he says, to do what we've learned, and to put into practice those things. And that takes time and it takes work. And often it's in direct contradiction to what it is that we want. But if we get caught up in what we want and what we want to do or think we want, right, we begin building off of things that will be shaken. Relationships, jobs, money, insecurity, all these things that if we rely on, won't last when the hard times come. You know, if I've built everything in my life off of my relationship, it can be stable through some hard things, but what happens when that relationship ends? What happens to my life, to my foundation? If it's my job or money, what happens when I get fired? Or if the money stops coming? Right? The offer from Jesus is to have something stable, something that will not be shaken, right? And this doesn't mean that life just becomes easy, that life is without struggle. But it means that something will still be standing after those storms. Jesus is giving us a path to stability, but we have to follow his instructions. We have to put it into practice. But unfortunately, I think there's an inherent problem that we have with instructions, and also us as humans. Most of the time, instructions are coming from somebody else, right? We're not giving ourselves instructions. And that means that most of the time, there are things that we don't necessarily want to do. And that's when things become difficult. It's easy to go with someone's instructions when they align with what we want. It's easy to listen to Jesus when it aligns with what we want. But what do we do when they start to divert from each other? Right? What are we choosing to do when we are challenged by something? You know, the moment we choose to do nothing, we become the foolish builder. And we are setting ourselves up for the winds just to come and to knock us down. So we have to see that these instructions are better and that they are for us, right? These instructions are for us. And I think that's the other interesting part of the scripture is that he says, whoever hears my words. And this is informing us to exactly who he's talking to, who it is that is called to follow these instructions. And it's not a bunch of heathens and sinners that have never heard of Jesus, right? It's to those who have heard his words and those that know him. People like us, people like me. And so as someone who grew up in church, right, I found myself caught in a very interesting tension. The tension of knowing him and hearing his words, but also thinking that those words did not apply to me, right? I was at church every Sunday. I was involved with our youth ministry, right? My parents are Christians. I was at all the church things. And so I felt like I had a pretty good handle on this idea of Christianity, on what it was. And so for me, that meant taking the next logical step, right? I was like, the next step would be, I'm gonna study the Bible and I'm gonna get baptized. That's what everyone else above me does, and that's what makes sense. So I spent over a year studying. Okay, we're doing the air quotes because I think during that whole process, through it all, I was the absolute definition of a foolish builder. I had felt like since I was already pretty good, right, especially compared to other people I knew, kids in my life, kids in my teen ministry, that there really wasn't much I had to change, that I had to put into practice. You know, the scriptures were cool, and it was good for me to know them, but when it came down to what my life looked like, what I was building, I could go off of my own instructions, my own choices. And this led to me making a lot of stupid mistakes in my early discipleship because I thought I knew better than God. I ended up with this extremely fake Christianity, you know? I knew a ton of scriptures. I knew all the right things to do, to say, and I had no problem looking at other people and seeing that they weren't doing them, only to take those same things and not apply them to myself as well. That same set of instructions. And the things I heard and knew were never put into practice. I was building foolishly with the instructions just right in front of my face. It's like trying to build Legos, but you just threw out the instructions. You're like, we're gonna make it happen, you know? And for a while, it was fine. I didn't know I was so foolish because the storms I faced either weren't that bad at the time or I didn't realize the severity of them. And then I got older and I moved out and life got a lot more real really fast. And very quickly I saw everything I built crumble. It all fell with a great crash and I was so surprised. You know, this whole time I thought I was doing things right, that things were pretty good. And you know, it makes me think of 1 Corinthians 10:12. It's one line. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you do not fall. That was me. I thought I was standing firm, so I had disregarded the instructions of Jesus because in my pride, my assumption was that I was okay, that I didn't need to put things I heard into practice. And because of that assumption, when the storms came, I was left standing in the rubble of what I had built, trying to pick up all the pieces and start over. You know, Jesus wants us to be able to live a stable life, to be secure when these storms come. But we can't do that if we are doing it our own way, right? And it's moments like these, for me at least, moments where things come crashing down, that we have to get real. We have to make hard choices. Are we going to keep doing the same thing that has brought us to where we are? Or are we going to get up and do things differently? We have to decide whose instructions we are going to follow. And so this morning, I have an object lesson for you guys. I know, very exciting. I'm going to have my helpers come up. Haven't really fully run this through yet. We got water, so we're going to get a tarp. You know, Brandon had his mysterious liquids and bottles pouring. I've got a bunch of blocks. I'm sure you guys can see where this is going. But we got a little preventative measure. I don't want to make Neil mad and get sound stuff wet or anything. Because that'd feel really bad. Thank you. There we go. All right, can you guys all see my little table? All right, cool. We were going to try and use Jenga. We lost Jenga. So I've got play blocks. Right? So we've talked a lot about following instructions, right? But what does that really mean? What does that look like? And I think, unfortunately, I can't tell you that for you. Because all of our lives are different. Our struggles are different. What we wrestle with is different. The storms that hit us are different, right? But I can use these blocks and hopefully make it more clear. You know, following the instructions is looking at our life compared to the Bible, right? It's taking things that we're learning and that we're hearing, and it's putting them where they're supposed to go, right? It's putting in the work to change, to grow, to lay things down correctly. And honestly, sometimes it's slow, and it's not always exactly what I want to be doing. But what we get from that is that even when the storms come, even when things happen, sorry about those two, we still have something left standing, right? We've lost some stuff off the top, right? Things that maybe we tried to do, we didn't fully change, we couldn't get over, but that's okay, because life happens. But we are still left with something. Thank you, Brandon. You know, what we see is that we're not left starting at ground zero. We're not picking up all of our pieces. And so there's another way we can build, right? The way that Jesus tells us not to. Oh, this is going to be way more fun. And to be the foolish builder is basically to say that we don't trust Jesus in his instructions. So we're just going to start stacking things up where we want. Because honestly, this is easy. This is kind of nice. I don't really got to worry about it because this is my way. Because I don't trust. I don't think those instructions are good enough for me. And we're left with something that, you know, it gets high nice and quick. And it's a lot less work. I had no instructions to follow, so I can just kind of start and stop where I want. I can try and add some more on top, you know? And I think usually it's fine for a while. But when we step back and when we look at life, and when the storms come, because they will, the storms will come. They're inevitable. When we build this way, we're just going to fall down every time. And then we're left with a pile of wet children's blocks and some water. And that's not how we're supposed to live, right? What we've built will be put to the test. And we have to make sure that it's up to code. And so this is the check-in, guys. This is what this series and this sermon was all about. And my challenge for all of us today is to take some time to take stock. To take a look and see where it is we're building and how we're doing it. Do we have the instructions? Are we doing things the right way? You know, we can't overflow if we aren't working off the right set of instructions. We have to build wisely with the things that we hear and that we learn and with the scriptures that we read. And what I really want for all of us is, you know, come December or next year, that we can look back and remember, one, the name of the series. I really hope, and I hope that for myself as well. But two, practically speaking, I want us to be able to remember and look back and see what is going to be different. right? And so I want us this morning to pick one thing. Pick something that has stuck out to you that you need to change. Something that has challenged you. Something that's inspired you. Take some time. Think about it. I hope you've all thought of something. If you have, I want you to write it down. Take out your phone, your notebook if you're old school, and jot that down. If you haven't, take some time later today to sit and think about it. Right? And then what I want us to do is after the last song or later this week, to go and tell somebody else. Right? Go and talk to somebody and tell them what it is you're trying to put into practice. You know, it's like New Year's resolutions. If we keep them to ourselves, no one will ever know, and then we'll never have to push ourselves to be better. But sometimes we need other people to hold us accountable and to push us higher. But I want us to remember one thing, that we need to do these things. We need to put the word into practice, or else our lives will be no different. And so I want you to remember your thing you wrote down, because now you've got to decide what you're going to do about it. Thank you.